So today we're going to talk about ethical guidelines that guide the use of humans and non-humans in research. We're going to talk about the history of the ethical guidelines that we currently use and where they came from. We're going to talk about the major principles of the APA Code of Ethics as it is applied to both human and non-human animals. Lastly, we're going to discuss the different kinds of research misconduct and how we can guard against that misconduct. So unfortunately, when we're talking about the ethical guidelines that we currently use, the reason we have them is because of the previous abuse of both humans and non-humans in research. A lot of this work involves medical experimentation that occurred in the US and in Germany during World War II, and in the years following. So the Nuremberg Code really sort of serves as our primary guide in developing a code of ethics with regards to research. The Nuremberg Code was developed in 1947, and it lists 10 points that researchers should use before using humans in any sort of medical research. Unfortunately, that is in response to Nazi researchers who said that the kinds of research they did with humans was no different than other kinds of medical research that was going on at the time. The courts actually disagreed with that assertion and said that because they had used x-rays and drugs to sterilize prisoners against their will, because they'd exposed prisoners to low pressure situations and cold conditions to test the limits of human endurance, and lastly, to expose prisoners to various diseases and poisons in an effort to test antidotes and treatments for those diseases and poisons, all went beyond the existing acceptable rules about what was going on. But at the time, there really wasn't anything written down that said these are the rules that everyone should be following. So the Nuremberg Code is a response, is an attempt to sort of write down a standard set of rules that can be applied to researchers that then, in case of research misconduct or abuse of prisoners or participants, that there can be some penalties that can be brought against the researchers. But research involving humans without their knowledge was not just going on in Nazi Germany during World War II. In fact, here in the United States, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments serve as a famous example of the use of people in research without their knowledge about what was happening. So in 1933, the U.S. Public Health Service began an investigation into the phases of syphilis and what happens when there's no treatment involved. So 399 African American men with latent syphilis and 201 men without the disease were enrolled in this study based on the finding that there was a high rate of syphilis in Tuskegee. Unfortunately, the individuals in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment had high rates of illiteracy, they were often poor sharecroppers, and didn't necessarily have the ability to make decisions about what would be in their best interests when they were enrolled in the study. This study lasted for almost 40 years, with given periodic clinical investigations by the researchers, and in 1942, the researchers actually intervened to prevent the participants from being treated. So by 1942, penicillin was in existence. We had treatments for syphilis that would have not reversed the damage that had already happened, but would have actually stopped any further damage. The researchers intervened for men who were joining the military during World War II to stop them from receiving treatment, because the military would normally test you for syphilis and automatically treat you. The researchers said, this is part of an ongoing experiment, please don't treat them. So this continued until 1972, when it slowly wound down because of a growing amount of distrust and public acknowledgement that this research was going on. But at the same time, so in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the researchers never actually infected individuals with syphilis. They basically tracked the individuals that already had it and denied them treatment. But in a similar ongoing experiment in Guatemala, the same primary investigator who was involved in the Tuskegee syphilis study was actually actively infecting people in Guatemala, mostly people in mental institutions prisoners and female prostitutes. In this case, they were not only avoiding treatment, but actually infecting them to see what the effects were and how likely infection was and how long it took before symptoms were evident. This was not just involving syphilis. They also looked at many other kinds of sexually transmitted infections, including gonorrhea. And in fact, this study involved a total of 1,300 people in Guatemala. It started to wind down in the 1950s and 60s, coming to light in the 1980s because of investigations by the National Institute of Health. So these cases really served as a foundation to explain for us why we needed a clear code of ethics. The APA Code of Conduct actually consists of 6 parts. The APA Code of Conduct suggests that all participants must be able to voluntarily participate. They have to have the option of opting out at any time. They have to know what they're getting involved in, which allows them to voluntarily participate. In addition, they have to give their informed consent to participate. Not only do they have to volunteer, but they actually have to know what they're getting involved in. So depending on the educational level, the reading ability, and the general understanding of the participants, researchers have a duty to watch out for them and to make sure that they're being protected and they know what they're getting involved in. In addition, researchers must maintain that the data is confidential and in many cases anonymous, so that research participants are not identified by name or other demographic variables. If you're collecting audio recordings or video recordings, those recordings, before they're ever released, have to be masked so that those individuals cannot be identified. During the participation in this study and immediately afterwards, the researchers have a duty of care to make sure that participants are not being harmed either psychologically or physically. These days even leads researchers to have to get approval before they even interview participants. So it used to be the case that if you were a historian and you were interested in interviewing people about their life experiences or things that had happened to them, you did not need to go to a college or university institutional review board, or IRB. You may remember we talked about this earlier in the course. Those IRBs, or institutional review boards, are the ones that are responsible for reviewing all research and making sure that if there's a risk to the participants, that it is those participants have mechanisms to be protected. It used to be the case that IRBs were not involved in approving interviews done by historians and other researchers unless it had an intervention component to it, where the researcher's going out or the historian is actually intervening in some way that might potentially be obviously harmful. Nowadays, because of cases where during an interview process of a traumatic event, people have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder or a reoccurrence of some of those symptoms, all interviews, all research involving humans of any kind must go through an IRB. Okay, so researchers have to make sure that their participants are voluntarily participating after having given informed consent, and you have to assure your participants that they can withdraw at any time with no negative outcome. Lastly, the data has to be confidential, and the benefits of the research must outweigh the costs to the participant. The IRB, or Institutional Review Board, is often the ones who evaluate whether or not the benefits outweigh the costs to the participant or participants. Those 6 principles make the foundation of the APA Code of Ethics. Now, sometimes though, it's difficult to get participants to volunteer to participate. So, you are allowed to induce them to participate, but there are a few principles that you have to follow. If you're going to try to coerce participants, your attempts to coerce them should not be excessive. So you shouldn't be offering $1,000 to participate in a 1-month-long study. You shouldn't be offering $10,000 to allow participants to be infected with malaria. Right? As we talked about, that study from the University of Washington where participants were offered $10,000 and given the opportunity to develop malaria after being treated with a vaccine really does break that code of ethics. You can't do that. Your low income, maybe a poor student, is going to volunteer for this study knowing they're going to get $10,000 and not really be concerned about the negative effects of malaria. And if the vaccine doesn't work, you've now put them at serious risk for long-term health complications. So not only should it not be excessive, but you shouldn't coerce them for any sort of risky procedures like malaria. You shouldn't put them at risk for stress, anxiety, depression, and if you're going to give them some sort of inducement. So in a lot of psychological research, what this often involves is extra credit. You have to give equally palatable alternatives. So if you're going to allow students to earn extra credit for participating in research, you also have to give them other ways to earn extra credit that are of similar magnitude, right? So you can't give students an option of, here, you can get 1% of your grade or 5% of your grade through extra credit, or instead you can write a 15-page paper, right? Those are not equally palatable. If you're going to allow students to get extra credit by participating in a 30-minute experiment, then the similar palatable alternative should be a 30-minute long paper or reading assignment that they do. Okay, those three things should guide you in trying to determine whether or not your coercion is too significant or too extreme. The other thing that researchers in psychology often use is deception. Deception really is a last resort. One study that I read suggested that less than 20% of all research in psychology uses deception anymore. It's pretty uncommon. The problem with deception is the moment you deceive your participants, they can't possibly give you informed consent. They don't know what's happening because you didn't tell them. It also causes people to mistrust research. Right? Now they're going to walk away, and especially if it's a significant amount of deception, they're not going to trust any other person who tries to get them involved in a study. Not only are they not going to participate in the future, but now they may not trust research findings that they read about in newspapers or magazines. So you really should think about the reaction of your participants to deception before you decide that you're going to use it. Lastly, at the end of a study, you have to debrief your participants. You have to tell them what the true goal of the research was. You have to give them a way of contacting you or someone else involved in the research in case they have concerns. And you have to tell them, you give them the option of knowing what the results are going to be later. What you'll find in the ethics unit is a sample debriefing statement that you can use if you're going to use deception of any kind, or at the end of a survey that your participants complete. You can give them that debriefing statement, add in an email address and a contact information and information about your study. That would satisfy that debriefing. Okay, now there's not just one kind of deception, right? Like in the Milgram experiment that's pictured here, the participants really didn't know what they were getting involved in, right? They were told that this is a study about learning and memory, and that the person who's being strapped to the chair and supposedly receiving shock is actually the participant, when in fact the person who's giving the shock is the one that's the participant in this study, and they've actually been tricked. That was a pretty significant amount of deception. Luckily, Milgram asked his participants afterwards how they felt about participating in this research, and more than 70% of them said actually they thought the findings of this research were important and that it was valuable. That is a good way to know whether or not your deception was too extreme or significant. So there are 4 levels of deception that we often talk about. The most minor form of deception is when participants can give informed consent about the treatments that are available. So you tell them there is a placebo group and a drug group in this study. You're going to be in one of these groups, okay? But they're not told which one they're assigned to. This is the only kind of deception that you're allowed to use in drug research, okay? You cannot have any more significant kind of deception. So drug research, you have to tell participants what are the possible groups they could be in, including if there's a placebo or a control group. The second level of deception is when you tell them that it's something in general. We're going to do a study about drugs, or we're going to do a study about learning or memory, but you're not actually going to tell them specifically what you're testing. You're not going to tell them what drugs you're involved in, how you're going to test learning, but it is a study about learning. The third level of deception is what was used by the Milgram experiments. In the third level of deception, you've completely misled your participants about the study. You fooled them. You say it's about learning and memory. You say that we know that shock helps people learn, when in fact this study is about obedience. Right? So your participants, again, are not able to give informed consent. These are very, very rare anymore to see these as a kind of research deception. Lastly, the ones that I haven't read about in many, many years are bystander effect studies. In bystander effect studies, oftentimes the participants are not told that they're participating in research until after the research is done. This would be a case where you go to a public area, you drop a bunch of papers on the ground, and you see who helps pick them up. Those participants did not know they were involved in a research study. You need to get their agreement to participate afterwards, but oftentimes this is the one that the participants hate the most. This is the one, I don't want you doing this kind of deception. If you want to do a bystander effect study, I want you to have participants sign up for a study ahead of time, meet you at a place, and when they get there, you do the manipulation, okay? So that would be more like a level 2 or level 3 kind of deception, depending on what you tell the participants ahead of time when they sign up for it. I do not want you involving participants in public areas without their knowledge ahead of time. Okay, so those are the 4 levels of deception. Now, we've really been talking about human research so far, but in fact, there is a portion of research that involves animals. Animal research, in psychology at least, makes up only a small proportion of all the research that's happening. Some estimates suggest somewhere between 7 to 8%, and most of that research in psychology at least is using rats and mice. Rats and mice account for more than 90% of all the psychological research that involves animals, okay? Less than about 0.5% of all research uses non-human primates, and only slightly more uses things like cats and dogs. But again, very, very rare. And there are multiple safeguards in place to ensure that animals are protected and cared for, and that we follow standardized guidelines to make sure that those animals receive the best possible care. The first is the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act was most recently amended in 1985. It allows the United States Department of Agriculture to periodically inspect facilities, and it gives colleges and universities and other research organizations guidelines that they have to follow for the minimum care of animals. Above that is the American Association for Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care, or ALAC. ALAC is sort of the gold standard of animal care. They perform inspections every 3 years. Research facilities that are ALAC accredited, provide the best level of care possible. In addition, every institution or university has to have an IACUC, an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. This committee is a part of the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and the IACUC committee evaluates just the use of animals in research and the general care they're getting. This involves faculty and administrators and members of the public around the university or institution, and they make sure that those animals are receiving high quality care, even when they're involved in research studies. And every research protocol that involves animals has to go through this IACUC committee and be approved before that research can begin. Okay, now when we talk about animal research, and I know sometimes, right, we talk about and maybe we see videos or things about the use of animals in research. Animals in research really do account for a small proportion. So here on this graph you can see this is the number of animals that are used for various purposes. The first 3 columns here are animals used for food. You can see we use a lot of fish, then it's poultry and chicken, then we get cattle, sheep, and pigs. Lastly, we get about 200 million wildlife that are killed by cats every year. And then you can see on the very end here is an estimate of how many animals are used in research every year. We are very, very cautious these days about how many animals we use in research. And again, the majority of those animals are rats and mice rather than monkeys or dogs or things like that. And we're really cautious, right? There's a lot of protocols that go into place to protecting those animals when they're involved in any sort of invasive research. And again, as I was mentioning, the majority of these animals are rodents. This is a graph showing the use of animals in all medical research, so not just psychological research. So we're mostly using mice. It's about 41% of all the animals used in research in the United States. About 32% of it uses fish. I know, right? Who would have guessed we use so many fish in research? Then you get rats, which account for about 8%. Then birds for 6%. Then cattle for about 5%. Then amphibians, fish, pigs, guinea pigs, about 0.5% are dogs. About 0.1% are non-human primates. Right? So really very few non-human primates, cats, dogs are being used in research. And a lot of these studies, by the way, this includes not just medical research, this also includes research where you're bringing in animals and you're tagging them, where you're giving them an anesthetic to knock them out so you can tag them and then re-releasing them. So this is any kind of ecological research or wildlife research that's happening. So that's part of why we see a lot of fish and some other animals that are being used in research. But again, right, very few of these are involved in psychological research. And most of that psychological research, as I mentioned in the beginning, about 90% of it involves rats and mice. But even though we talk about that we don't use that many animals for research, public opinion really is moving against the use of medical testing for animals. So this is an NSF study. The NSF study collects data on how people feel about the use of medical testing, the morality of medical testing in animals. This chart here goes from 2001 to 2008, and you can see that in 2001, about 65% of the participants here thought that it was morally acceptable to use animals, and only 26% thought it was morally wrong. By 2008, that number has dropped, so that only 56% think it's morally acceptable, but now 38% thinks it's morally wrong. This trend has continued, so that a Pew study suggests that about 56% of Americans saw that it was morally acceptable in 2011, but by 2013, only 50% thought that it was acceptable to use animals in research. So people generally are becoming less supportive of animal research. So why is that happening? Well, I suspect that part of this is that researchers have not done a very good job of talking to people about the use of animals in research, right? We basically just assume that people are going to accept what we use animals for and that it automatically justifies itself because it's research and it's this higher order sort of philosophical pursuit of knowledge and the improvement of humans, when in fact we really need to do more to reach out to people and to talk about them. A woman by the name of Dr. Allison Bennett at University of Wisconsin at Madison recently wrote an opinion piece talking about that researchers have a duty to get out there and to counteract arguments against the use of animals in research. So, for example, Dr. Bennett has suggested that we need to tell people, look, the treatments that we currently have for Parkinson's disease are the result of animal care and use procedures. That the way that we develop antidepressant drugs or anti-anxiety drugs, all of those things have involved animals. A lot of the ways, valve replacement, treatments for insulin, stem cell research, right? Not just psychological research, but all medical research really does provide a benefit. And we also have to remind people that we are really very cautious about how we use animals in research, that we are very cautious both because we care about the animals and because it's expensive, right? We don't want it. There's not a lot of money floating around in research. So researchers don't want to do an experiment that wastes an animal and doesn't get any good data and doesn't care for that animal. Okay, so both human and animal research have procedures in place to try to protect participants, okay? But as I was mentioning in the very beginning, one of the things that we have to assure both institutional review boards and participants is that their data is confidential, that there's no way that participants can be identified. If you're going to make recordings, either video or audio recordings, you have to get the participants' consent ahead of time, unless they're in a public setting. So if a participant is in a public park or in a public street, you don't actually have to get their consent as long as you haven't harmed them or you haven't manipulated them or identified them in any way, okay? But as you might imagine, if you start recording participants in public and then it later comes out that you're recording people against their will, even though it is technically legal, it doesn't look good, right? You're going to cause people to be mistrustful of research in general. Now, let's talk a little bit about research misconduct. In general, there are three ways, the National Science Foundation, three types of research misconduct. There's data fabrication, which is where you're making up results and reporting them. So you haven't collected any data at all. You are essentially making them from scratch. There's data falsification, where you're manipulating research materials or equipment or results so the data record's not accurate. One of the most common things we've seen recently is people manipulating images. image manipulation of videos or pictures that make genotyping or genetic studies look more significant than they really are. Studies of brain cell growth that make the brain cell growth look more significant than it really is. Brain scanning studies that have altered the color scheme to make the contrast different. So again, the differences look bigger than they really are. Those are all cases of data falsification, and they have pretty significant effects on your career. Another one is plagiarism. Now, we talked about plagiarism earlier in the course. So in plagiarism, as we mentioned, it's the appropriation of another person's ideas, results, or words without giving them credit. Now, and we've kind of talked about, right, taking someone's ideas and not citing them. But another example that we often see in research is where you publish somebody else's work without giving them credit. Or self-plagiarism, where you publish the same content in multiple places, right? Researchers, it happens, and there are ways to detect that now. And you can imagine, right, as a researcher, if your career is based on the number of publications you have, then publishing the same article multiple times makes it look better, but we have some really sophisticated ways of preventing that from happening nowadays, as I'll talk about in just a minute. But, by the way, it is also self-plagiarism if you use a paper for a new class that you wrote in a previous class, right? That is self-plagiarism. You are not allowed to turn in a paper from a previous class in a new class without the explicit permission of the instructor. I know, some of you are like, whoa, wait, that's a bad thing? That is a bad thing. And in fact, actually, there are some famous examples where research misconduct happens. I kind of mentioned earlier in the course that research misconduct really does make up a small proportion of all the research that's happening, right? There are not that many cases of high-level, significant research misconduct. I think in the beginning of the course I talked about an example where students in a PhD, in a master's program in engineering at University of Chicago copied the methods from an earlier student in the lab, and they just copied that method, cut and pasted it into every single master's thesis. The University of Chicago removed all of their degrees, right? This is a very significant problem when it does happen. I'll give you another example. Dietrich Stapel from the University of Tilgen in Amsterdam like 2011, was accused of research misconduct. He's a famous social psychologist, was the chair and the dean of his program, was a rising star in social psychology. Turns out that he had fabricated his data over his entire career, from his dissertation all the way until his most recent data, and that they were able to use algorithm to detect data falsification, to reanalyze all of his data to prove that in fact he had falsified it. And he eventually did. He returned his degree, he lost his job, so he no longer has a PhD or any degree, and all of his work has been retracted, and he's sort of a good example of the significant negative effects that happen because of research misconduct. In order to prevent research misconduct, a few things have started to change. So for a long time, researchers have been required to record data in some sort of semi-permanent way, and it becomes suspicious if you don't have it. Dietrich, one of the things that happened when they tried to reanalyze his dissertation data from his PhD, he said his data had been destroyed, he had lost it. That is a red flag nowadays for researchers who are concerned about whether there's been research misconduct. You really should be prepared to share your data with others. In fact, more and more publishers now require that authors submit their data sets in their Excel file or some other spreadsheet program along with their manuscripts, because improvements in technology now allow us to detect research misconduct. For example, there's a program called Deja Vu. Deja Vu scans existing literature and compares one paper of interest to see if you've republished that paper somewhere else already, to detect that self-plagiarism. And then there's a technique called error analysis, where we can actually look for standard deviations or variability in your data to see if your data has been falsified. Right? That error analysis basically allows us to look at humans who maybe have falsified data, because unfortunately humans don't enter data at random. Humans have patterns when they make up data, and error analysis allows us to detect whether it's human-created data versus it's data that you actually collected in the real world. So we've gotten pretty good at detecting some of this data fabrication and data misconduct. Okay, we'll stop right there. If you have any questions, please send me an email.